Robert Moss. He's presently syndicated columnist for the London Daily Telegraph, co-author of the best-selling book, The Spike with Arnaud de Borchgrave, which is going to be #1 on the New York Times best-selling list this Sunday. This Sunday. He was an editor of the Foreign Report for The Economist, and in October, his new novel, Death Beam. The other night, the Economist people were here, and you must be some bright fella to be part of that family.
They're a very articulate group, and they coruscate. They spark off each other. It's a very exciting magazine.
They what?
They coruscate.
What does that mean?
Oh, they sparkle, They bubble. They're effervescent. I don't carry the dictionary in my pocket, but there are some words that fit situations better than others.
No, it's done remarkably.
We've been staggered by its success. It really took off. I think the public mood was very ready for this book. And I think one reason the public was excited about this book was that it showed something about how the Soviets are operating around the world today. If you consider other spy thrillers and spy movies, there are relatively few in recent years who have depicted the Soviet KGB as a realistic villain, or indeed as any kind of villain at all. The rut set in, by the way, from my perspective, when Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, was told that it was passé to send his British hero out to do battle with the Russians. That was old hat. That was Cold War stuff. James Bond should go and fight multinational corporations. And so Ian Fleming got rid of Smersh, that sinister Soviet spy organization, and invented Spectre, which is something like a multinational company. The Spike puts the KGB in center stage as a realistic organization, which is probably running more covert operations around the world than all Western secret services put together. And I think the public were interested to see the KGB depicted in these fictional terms.
I must ask, earned quite a few enemies who keep repeating the libel that you have been employed by the Central Intelligence Agency. How did that all start?
Well, Barry, it really starts historically, thematically, let's say, with Lenin's piece of advice that if you label something effectively, you don't have to argue with it. Now, I've been intrigued in recent months by the phenomenon that some of those on the radical left, who are first to scream McCarthyite, witchfinder, when people start talking about Soviet covert operations, are also the first to use McCarthyite techniques.
Sure.
McCarthyism is not just a phenomenon of the right. I mean, let's get that clear. People on both extremes, operators on both sides of the spectrum, use McCarthyite tactics of smear and innuendo. Arnaud and I have been accused in recent months by some of the people who don't like the Spike. Some of them, in fact, seem to identify themselves with characters in the Spike who are manipulated by the Soviets. We've been accused of having been CIA agents. Now, in my case, that allegation was first made 6 years ago by Soloveitchik, the CIA defector who maintains fairly open contacts with Cuban and Soviet intelligence today and names CIA agents around the world, real and alleged and imagined, in order to bust up CIA operations. The first allegations against me, historically, were quite interesting. I had been a foreign policy advisor to Margaret Thatcher, who is now the British Prime Minister. And a press leak had reported that I'd been involved in drafting a speech for her, attacking the Soviet military buildup, which led the Russians to call her the Iron Lady, a tag which stuck and got her a lot of votes in the elections. People were rather impressed by the name the Iron Lady. It was 6 weeks after that press leak that I was first accused of having connections with the CIA. I sued the newspapers and publications in Britain that made this allegation and got apologies and substantial libel damages. I thought the matter had ended there. I mean, I've never worked for the CIA. I'm not a U.S. citizen. I would not work for a U.S. government organization. And in fact, as a journalist, I wouldn't work for any government organization because I think that would be incompatible with my role. I've had contacts, friendships with many people in many different Western secret services, but that is my business as a foreign correspondent. And if I claim to talk about espionage, how could I possibly sustain the claim to authenticity without having friends and contacts? But these allegations die hard. And as I say, they're seized upon by people who like McCarthyism as a way of discrediting their enemies. And they've been used about a year after the Spike came out by those who would like to see the Spike lie down or go away.
Instead,
Well, I think the general question of what links journalists can and should have with intelligence organizations, this is a good thing to debate, and it's something worth looking at seriously. Arnaud and I, as authors of The Spike, have been privileged to have friends, as I mentioned earlier, in Western secret services over many years. I've talked personally to a number of important Soviet defectors from the KGB and the GRU. These are the sources that you have and on which you can build a realistic picture of how the spy world operates. I don't believe that I have ever been duped by a Western Secret Service. I believe there have been one or two attempts along the way to do so. There have also been attempts made to recruit me, and I know to recruit my co-author Arnaud too, by a number of services, which we flatly rejected. Relations with the CIA. Well, I've been responsible for a number of stories that caused considerable embarrassment at CIA headquarters. I was the first reporter to describe in detail, for example, how the CIA was getting its estimates on the Soviet military buildup completely wrong. It was underestimating the Soviet military buildup by a factor of 50%. It was after my reports that the CIA turned around and overnight doubled its estimates. I've been highly critical of the CIA in many of its incarnations and caused some embarrassment to some people there who I don't believe knew how to do their job. Now, this is a different kind of relationship, I would maintain, from that of a reporter who meets people from the KGB or another hostile secret service like the Cuban DGI, and never reports on the activities of those agencies, although he may go out and crusade against the supposed wickedness and villainy of the CIA. I know many reporters, and I don't think you would want me to name them on this program, who have had contacts with Soviet and Cuban diplomats who are in fact spies. Now, having such contacts does not make those reporters Soviet or Cuban agents. Other things they may do may or may not make them agents, but contacts with intelligence operatives are not sufficient to sustain the view that this man is an agent and under control. But I have said to such people, and sometimes in radio and TV debates, I have said to them, don't you think it's time you recanted? Here you are, you've been writing articles attacking the CIA. You've been meeting Soviet and Cuban spies. You don't attack the KGB or the DGI. Why is this? Why this imbalance? And aren't you, in fact, serving the purposes of hostile services, even if you are not consciously aware of doing that? They've usually had little or nothing to say in reply.
You say you sued in Great Britain as a result of the charges made against you. Are you going to sue the reporter in the United States that made the comment here?
Well, we've been looking very, very seriously at one or two publications and what they've been saying. I mean, there's one in particular, Soho News, which has published a series of straight lies which would be probably of such an order as to be held liable for criminal libel proceedings under British law. Of course, American law is different. We're looking at these very carefully. There comes a point when your tolerance for people telling straight lies about you has run out.
How did you meet Arnaud de Borchgrave? On that very point that you've just touched on, over the years, people have said, I like Arnaud de Borchgrave a great deal. He has fantastic style and verve and instincts, and he's just an amazing man. I get the picture of him wandering through darkest Africa with the bumbershoot and total linen, complete linen for service for six. At any rate, and they say that fascist, etc., etc.
Well, I did meet Arnaud somewhere once, and I was coming from Angola. I was there during the Civil War. I was with Savimbi on the day that his forces captured the cigar rations of the Cuban army, as a matter of fact, and as a cigar smoker, I was delighted to sit under the bushes with his guerrillas smoking Havana's best. But I met Arnaud. I just come from the bush in fatigues, and there was some very stylish dinner party taking place, which required black tie, and since I just come from the bush, I didn't have black tie, and Arnaud looked at me as if I was beyond the pale and said, Robert, a gentleman is always equipped for any occasion, no matter where he's coming from. But I first met Arnaud when I was a young reporter on The Economist. I'd established a reputation of writing about terrorism at that stage. I was already lecturing at the Royal College of Defence Studies in London, the premier military academy on terrorism. And Arnaud arrived, and his reputation had preceded him, of course. And he said he wanted to consult me. I was very flattered. I was 22 years old or something. And here was Arnaud de Borchgrave of Newsweek.
He was 23.
That's really classified information.
Yes.
We can't get into those issues for reasons of national security. Arnaud turned up and he said he received a telephonic death threat after naming a Palestinian operative in Geneva. Should he take it seriously? Should he hide out in the English countryside for a period of weeks or months? I said, Arnaud, if they're going to get you, they're not going to telephone you first and tell you something.
Exactly.
So he went back to Geneva. But by the way, Barry, that's another example of the risks that you run when you take a controversial stand or a strong stand in public as a journalist or as a commentator in general. We've been smeared. People have tried to smear us. We've also received more direct, more brutal kinds of threats. I've received death threats from a number of different groups, particularly, interestingly enough, in view of the conservative image people sometimes associate with us. Most of my death threats have come from extreme rightist organizations, particularly anti-Semitic and neo-fascist groups, because of my support for Israel, and PLO-related groups.
Just like that.
I don't think Gaddafi is quite as powerful as that. I think he would probably like to be responsible for all the evil going on everywhere. He is, of course, a very strange, inspired man. I mean, he hears voices. He's inspired in that sense. He's also no fool. He has a small nation in terms of population, sitting on a lot of oil, which he has turned into a base for terrorism around the world. He's done it with a little help from his friends. He's also allowed his country to become a subcontractor for the Soviet bloc. His intelligence services work in close coordination with the East Germans, who are the Soviets' subcontractors in turn for training and directing Libyan covert operations around the world. He has supported Soviet foreign policy on numerous occasions. He's become an arms dump for the Soviet bloc, one of its forward caches of arms in the Mideast, which would be used in a future confrontation around the Gulf or elsewhere. So he's had a little support. His revolutionary enthusiasm knows no international frontiers. He supports groups ranging from Muslim secessionists in the Philippines to the Irish Republican Army in Northern Ireland to Latin Americans and, of course, many wings of the Palestinian movement. And there's no doubt about it. Libya is a terrorist state. It pursues terrorism as a central facet of state policy and does so with no apology to anyone. One of the themes I take up in the new book, Death Beam, coming out in October, is a confrontation over space weapons. The Soviets have made very big advances over the last 20 years in developing high-energy lasers, particle beam weapons, for eventual deployment on space battle stations. The United States is a bit ahead of the Soviet Union in space shuttle technology, space vehicle technology, but the Soviets are probably ahead on balance in the weapons themselves. So the race is on, and I think this, in all the defense arena, is going to be the most crucial area of all, and it also offers the possibility of a quick fix, A new plan being studied by the Pentagon suggests that in 2.5 years, the United States could set up the most effective anti-ballistic missile defense system ever conceived through the deployment of space cruisers equipped with laser weapons. They're still testing these things with varying results. Terrorism and who supports it and what the hell we can do about it. Because one of the conclusions that I have reached is that the United States itself is highly vulnerable, and that one of the trends in the next couple of years will be for the terror international groups to target the United States. One of the things I described at the ADL meeting was the fact that the PLO, in the view of some intelligence analysts, has been establishing a secret network of three-man cells in this country, linking up with the remnants of the Ayatollah Khomeini's underground and some revolutionary black Muslim groups. And in effect, they have sleeper agents, which means people who are kept in waiting for the moment to launch some new offensive. Their particular targets, I'm informed, are energy installations, nuclear power plants, electrical generators, and so on, many of which are rather underprotected in this country. So we may expect some joy from that quarter in the next year or two.
In what way?
Well, I believe that if we get another major Middle East crisis, we see it brewing up already. We see Naif Hawatni, the leader of the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, an openly Marxist-Leninist pro-Soviet faction. Naif Hawatni was threatening that if the Israelis are allowed to destroy Palestinian bases in Lebanon, then the PLO will act to cut off the flow of oil to the west from the Gulf. He made that threat last week quite publicly. Now, if we got a crisis of that kind, it would be quite conceivable that attacks on energy installations in major Western countries, particularly the U.S., would ensue as part of a rounded pattern of PLO activity. They have attacked energy installations in Germany in the past. They plotted to blow up the big fuel depots in West Berlin, and that attack was averted only because of an Israeli tip-off to the West Germans. The question, I think, for any society like this in dealing with such terrorist ambitions is, do they have the informants, do they have the sources in the terrorist milieu itself to have foreknowledge of what the terrorists intend to do and to preempt those operations?
And what's your view?
My view is that this country is wide open. If I were an international terrorist, there are few countries I would rather operate in than the United States.
And what do we do about that to change it?
Well, we have to consider the whole state of the security picture. How do you mobilize your security resources so that you can, as I say, have foreknowledge of what these groups intend to do? Because if you concentrate on putting guards around every individual or every installation that can be targeted by terrorists, you'll use a lot of manpower and money with no joy, really, no adequate results, because you can never protect every facility that could be attacked by terrorists. You have to adopt a different line, which is to get inside these organizations and make sure that the FBI or whoever else is responsible for these things has informants in the right places. It's a real question today. If the man who tried to kill President Reagan had been monitored by the FBI at the time as a member of the American Nazi Party, might he have been picked out as a potential assassin and perhaps defused in some way? That's a question. Where you have a terrorist organization, you need, as a society, sources inside it who can tell you what it intends to do. The only reason the Israelis do so well against terrorism is because they have such sources and operate that way. think that
very strong suspicions about some of the people in the media who were carrying the water of the Soviet Union on their shoulders in filled buckets. What can you do about that?
Well, I'm alarmed. What alarms me most of all, Barry, is self-deception. There are people who are consciously motivated by an extremist ideology. There are people who are consciously working for foreign government organizations. Such people are always likely to be in a minority. But there is still an infinite capacity for self-deception. Think how unacceptable it was in many sections of the U.S. media to discuss a subject like Soviet involvement in terrorism until recently. And in fact, until the Reagan administration made it fashionable to do so. Some of us, like myself, have been talking about this for years. I gave a speech at the Jerusalem Conference on International Terrorism in Israel 2 years ago, which made world headlines everywhere, really, except the New York Times, in which I quoted PLO defectors and Soviet defectors on the training of Palestinians in the Soviet Union and on the training of other terrorist groups by the PLO in its turn. This was not considered useful information or newsworthy information in some quarters of the American media. I found that surprising, and I think that it relates to a general problem of wishful thinking and self-deception. If you want to make out that it all is for the best in the best of possible worlds, that the Soviets are presided over by liberal men of goodwill, as we hope our politicians will be, instead of by totalitarian dictators, well, then you don't really want to give much attention and publicity to embarrassing facts, such as the fact that the Soviet Union, and not just Gaddafi, supports terrorism as an act of state policy. So such facts get suppressed. What do you do about it? Well, I'm a journalist. I'm in the business of publishing and making public what I know, and that is my answer, exposure. But the irony of the spike, Barry, was really got more of a reception and more of an effect with the spike than in many years of publishing non-fictional articles. I think that's because we got through some of the media blockages which we have found as journalists in other ways. I mean, we can't complain of having had inadequate and unsatisfactory journalistic careers. We have. But some sections of the media have not been interested in stories which we have considered to be the main story. And I consider that today, the question of the Soviet Union, its international activities, its espionage, its covert action, I consider that to be on the international scene the main story. I think that to sit around and discuss politics and what you think about the CIA or the Reagan administration without realistically taking account of what the Soviets want to do is like sitting around in 1939 and discussing everything except Mr. Hitler and what Mr. Hitler might want to do. And I find it surprising that not everybody today seems to go along with this perception. But the public in general, I think, does share that perception. And as you say, I think that this primarily accounts for the extraordinary success of the spike. It's used a lot. There is something called the Rapid Deployment Force in the United States. But again, we have to consider the other part of the picture, to consider what the U.S. needs in isolation from the question of what the Soviet Union has, is like watching the football game on TV and watching only one team bouncing around the field playing with the ball. You won't understand what that team is doing if you can't see both teams playing the game.
Exactly.
The game that the Soviets are playing in this respect is very interesting. They have a tremendous airlift capacity for rapid deployment, a tremendous airlift capacity. They showed that in what they did in Ethiopia a few years ago. They showed it in what they did in Afghanistan. And, of course, their land borders are a lot closer to a crucial area like the Gulf or like Western Europe than the borders of the United States. So the real question is, how does the United States reassure allies and friends that it needs in areas like the Middle East, that it has the mobilization ability to match the Soviets if they should, for example, make a grab for the petrol pumps in Saudi Arabia or around the Gulf? There are only two answers to that. Number one, the United States could deploy troops on the ground. Number two, it needs a mobile force with carriers and so on that can move in fast.
Robert Moss on WMCA, do you think that a Soviet-American confrontation is inevitable?
I think that there is going to be a deepening confrontation. I think it's very difficult to avoid. The key reason for that is not the policies of the Reagan administration or the policies of any other American administration that might exist. The key reason is that the Soviet Union has been systematically plundering and looting its economy for years to build the biggest war machine the world has seen, and will be increasingly tempted to use that machine to assert its influence and to get economic and other benefits that it cannot develop peacefully for itself. Again, we have to read the Soviet publications, look at what the Soviets themselves are saying and thinking, and if you read their rhetoric and read through the weary phraseology, you will find, I believe, an increasingly militaristic and also racist drumbeat. Problems in Poland, of course. I believe that they will eventually invade Poland. I'm sorry to have to say it, but I believe that they will eventually do that. But they have a leadership problem. Brezhnev is an old man. None of them are spring chickens. They're going to be replaced soon. But the key fact to look at is the size of the Soviet war machine and the likelihood that they will wish to assert their temporary moment of dominance in a way that the United States, as a democratic country, never saw fit to do.